To introduce, of course, everyone knows him, Brian Yop, the Director of Programs at Motor Cities. And take it away, Brian. Tell us how to get some money from Motor Cities.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nancy. And welcome everybody. Welcome back. Familiar faces, new faces, which is always a good mix here when we're talking about our Motor Cities grants. So hopefully today's presentation will enlighten you on the grant process or update you for those who have been returning grant recipients, to update you on what's new for 21 and 22. But let's talk about the grants. So our challenge grant program, which is what we'll primarily be talking about today, but I'll switch back and forth. So you'll hear me talk about challenge grants and you'll hear me talk about mini grants. So our challenge grant program is the one that allows you to sort of gather the most funds and support for your project. It is a matching program in which we reimburse 20% of eligible expenses. So if you've got a $100,000 project, you're building a section of a roof and you're spending 100 grand on it, you're eligible to get 20,000 back from us. If you've got a $10,000 project and you're installing a new exhibit, you receive $2,000 back from us. So it's a 20% eligible reimbursement. And it is for projects that happen during our federal fiscal year. Because we are an affiliate of the National Park Service, we operate on their fiscal year, which is October 1st to September 30th of the following year. That's why when you look at the schedule for the grants, we're going to be accepting grants that are going to become active as of October 1st. That's because it fits within that fiscal year. So we kind of answering that question right off the bat. But if you have any questions, you can chime in as I go through, or you can put them in the chat, and maybe it'll help everybody else as we go through. Just a little history in our grant program. We started funding grants almost immediately after. We were founded in 1998. We started funding grants in 2002. And over the 20 plus years, we funded over $1.5 million in grants to over 300 different projects. So the variety that you've heard on the call today is indicative of the sort of projects that we funded, whether it's large museum exhibits, whether it's educational elements at events, whether it's programming in schools. I mean, all these sorts of things have been part of our discussion, whether it's infrastructure to put in bathrooms, of course. So all of these things have been part of what we funded over the years. And that funding, you all have leveraged more than $5 million in additional support. So it shows everyone how powerful you are when you get a small amount of seed money. And that's why we call it a challenge grant, because we infuse a certain amount of funding and that allows that funding to be multiplied in the community. So bravo. So we are certainly accountable for every dollar that we put out there. You're leveraging about $8 in community. That's between the actual cash funding, and all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the term volunteer. And volunteers mean a lot to our calculations with the National Park Service. Volunteer time is worth more than what most people are being paid in their regular job, somewhere around the $24 an hour mark, and sometimes even more depending on their specialization. So volunteers are extremely valuable, and you all know that as you do your work. But for every dollar we put in, $8 are being leveraged in the community, and that's a huge return on investment. Talked about the challenge grants. Okay, so some notes for this 21-22 grant program. The grant cycle will include both mini grants, which have no match required, but they have an upper limit of $1,500. So those are sort of smaller, high impact grants for small projects that, we infuse the funds. We see great turnaround on those. No match required, but they don't have an upper limit of $1,500. Then there are the challenge grants, which again, I mentioned are 20%, but they are matching. So those give you opportunity to leverage more and get more out of those bigger projects. So those are two different types of grants we'll talk about. In 2021-22, our focus areas will continue to be education. So for instance, Anne-Marie and Chris talking about opportunities to be direct with our young people and infuse something there. Those sorts of projects will actually receive additional points in our scoring system. So you're already one step ahead just by being involved in that. And in projects that exemplify diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we, Motor Cities as a board and organization, adopted our diversity, equity, and inclusion values as of 2019 and look to have those implemented across all of our programming and our projects. So any project that talks about underserved communities, that talks about those who are otherwise outside of our normal bubble, and the term normal is very, subjective, but we're looking for ways that we are including more voices to these stories. So whether it's ethnic diversity, whether it's national diversity, language barriers, ableness community, whether it is LGBTQ issues and rights. These things are things that we would like to see addressed. And so those who are addressing those also receive a little bit bonus points to try to get those projects going. And then projects which allow for virtual presentation. Of course, we all understand the year that we've gone through and that we're still going through. So a lot of people have been inspired to pivot their programming and look for other ways that they can present things. So again, virtual programming receives that extra boost for this year to try to spur those projects along. So those are important notes. I think one of the most important ones to make a clear for those who are joining us here and those who will be watching the recording later is that this year's federal cycle is in a bit of a turnover. Stop me if you've heard this before, but there are issues with budget with the federal government. So we are looking at what's going to happen with the funding that normally supports our grant program. So I will say to you again, these funds for 21-22 are contingent upon some decision making on the federal level with their budget. So we're going to go through our entire grant process with optimism that everything will be smoothed out. And by the time we're ready to award the grants, the funds will be released and be in place. But I just want to let you know that as we go through this, that there's a budget issue behind that we hope we'll have figured out by the time we're ready to award the grants. But we let you know up front as you're doing the application process that these are contingent upon those federal funds for the 21-22 year. So with all that being said, we check eligibility. We ask ourselves, are you a recognized nonprofit organization, a government entity, or an educational institution in the National Heritage Area? So we only grant to organizations whose address is in the Heritage Area or whose service supports programs in the National Heritage Area. We have people who say, I run the National Corvette Museum and we're in Bowling Green, Kentucky, but our project is going to be with the local Michigan Corvette, group. And so we may be eligible for a grant. That works. If you're saying I want to fund our project that's going to support a museum that's in Spokane, Washington, then it doesn't work. So we have to work on projects that are local to the heritage area because that's what we were created to do. And that's where we need to invest our support. So if you are there, then the check mark is there. You are indeed eligible. All right, so do you have a project that is designed to highlight the rich automotive and labor heritage of our region? So again, that's what we focus on. Though some people have been able to take the story and stretch it beyond strictly automotive, the project that we're talking about has to be focused on automotive. We can build a park, but it has to be focused on the auto story, the labor story of our region, like the park I showed you before. So if you do that, then we can check that one off and you are eligible. Do you have a timeline that fits into completion by the dates we described in 2022? So we're talking about projects that start as of October 1st of 2021 that will be completed as of September 30th of 2022. So that is what we're looking for. If you have a project that fits into that timeline, then we are almost there. That means you're in the right place. And then, as I mentioned earlier, having to be a member of the Motor Cities National Heritage Area, this again, you're invested in us, we're investing in you. And so we would want any partner to become a member as you apply for grants. So if you can do that, then we have checked all these boxes and you are indeed eligible for our grant program. You can stay on the line and we will continue to discuss with you. Hooray, you are eligible and we're ready to move forward. So now let's talk about our application. Our application will be online here, motorcities.org/grants. You can find it at the top of our webpage. When you go to the webpage, there's a grants and programs tab or programs tab that drops down. It shows you where the grants are, so you can click on it there. But if you can go right to motorcities.org/grants, you'll find our grant application, and it will be live as of June 1st. So that is beginning next week. That is the application information. And now the moment you've been waiting for, we teased it long enough. Let's talk about the forms. So let's get into how you actually complete the process. For those who are familiar with this, I'm going to step through what you'll see on the website, each one of the sections that you'll have to fill out, a little bit of explanation behind it for those who are first timers, or sometimes it creates confusion. But let's talk about the forms. So first of all, when you get into the project application, you'll have to enter, and let me also say this is true for both the challenge grants, the bigger grant, and the mini grants. So you'll have to enter in some basic information, of course, to identify yourself. So this is true there. I'll tell you where the differences come, but these are the same. So the project name will have to be identified, of course. So what are you calling it? The project start and end date, remembering that it has to be sort of in between the period of time that I described earlier. And we want to make sure it is going to fall there. You set the end date. So sometimes people set it up and they put their information in there, then they'll get awarded the project and they'll come back and say, oh, Brian, it looks like we're going to be, slightly delayed. Can I reset? You can reset it because you set the end date. So you tell me when the project is going to be done, but we do want you to stick between whatever you describe. So if there's a change in it, you would let us know, but you're setting the end date. So it's not us that's forcing it. Does the project involve a National Historic Landmark? This is always important as we report back to the Park Service that it is that much sweeter for them to see a project that involves work on a National Historic Landmark, like we talk about the Fort Piquette plan or the Rouge plan, or some of the places that we work with are historic landmarks as well, which is always valuable. Of course, you have to identify your organization's name and your federal tax ID. So this is your federal tax ID, not your state of Michigan incorporation, federal tax ID that proves that you are indeed a nonprofit or whatever, category you fall under. So we would, and there's a point later in the application where you actually attach that piece to it, but you would put your tax ID there. Of course, again, we're checking off that you would be a member of Motor Cities, and then the mission area that you address. You see education here, but when you, in the form, when you actually click this, it actually goes to our 3 areas of mission focus, which is education, preservation, and heritage tourism. So whatever your project fits, that's where you would categorize yourself. That just keeps an eye on how balanced our grant approach is. Some common questions here is on the next section, we will talk about who the authorizing official is. This is the person who has the authority to sign agreements on your behalf. So sometimes that person is not the exec. It may not be the executive director. It might have to be the chair of the board or there's some commissioner. Dick, I know you talked about having to work with county parks, for instance. I mean, not county parks, the state DNR. So there may be a question of who has to sign an agreement when you're submitting it. So even though you're submitting it, you need to find out who that person is. Sometimes that person is one and the same. Sometimes they're, different people. So it all depends. But that is the authorizing person. This is also the person who, if you were approved, would receive the announcement letter and the agreement to sign. So again, I'll get to who the communication people are, but this would be the person who would have to sign the agreement. Then we talk about the project contact. So this would be the person that would be most familiar with me, the person who would be in contact throughout the length of the project. So once it's awarded and we're rocking and rolling, am I going to be talking to Roger each time I have a question about the project, or is there another person I need to talk to as things go along? So this person can be different than the other point of contact. Again, could be the same. And then the third section is the fiscal contact. Again, some organizations are set up where there's an accountant or there's someone who manages the funding piece that's not going to be the same as the person who you're talking to about the project. This will be important when you get ready to submit those tallies for reimbursement. This person needs to have access to the invoices, the timesheets, the canceled checks, all those sorts of things that you would need to substantiate your expenses. So again, that may be another person, or you may be wearing that hat as well, which a lot of people do. So as you go through the application, that's how you define those different individuals. Let's talk about the cost of the project. So in this section, you would be entering the total project cost. So how is that different than the total eligible cost? Well, let me tell you, the total project cost may be $100,000, but of that $100,000, if you're saying the project is going to require you to do things that happen before the grant period begins, or if the project is going to require you to do some fundraising, which we can't fund, or you have to buy something that's ineligible for the rest of the project cost, outside of what you're describing, then that's ineligible. So we would have to only be talking about total project cost of maybe $100,000, but maybe your actual work that is not fundraising, not lobbying, not food or entertainment, or any of those sorts of extraneous costs is $90,000. So you need to put that amount here, what actually is eligible, if you need to subtract anything out of that. A lot of times people are straightforward and are able to delineate those costs and don't have to worry too much about it. But just in case, those might be 2 different numbers. So you want to identify what is eligible within your project that aren't, and I have them listed here, are not falling under one of these categories. And then you list the part that you're requesting for Motor Cities. Again, do the calculation. If you've done a $100,000 project, then your requested share for Motor Cities should be $20,000. And then the applicant's share should be the $80,000, should be the remaining amount. So you need to, do the basic math. And believe me, there's a grant committee that reviews these, that they will notice if even the basic math has not been done correctly. They go, I don't know. But they can't do this.
New math? Is that new math or the old math?
No, well, I'm an old math guy, and I'm not even as old a math guy as some of these other old math guys. So I think old math. If you can tell me that 100,000 minus 20,000 is 80,000, then whatever form of math that is, I'm with that. So if it's different from that, I don't want to hear about it. But yeah, we want to talk about that sort of math, and that's what you're filling in here.
Hey, Brian, so
Yes.
quick question there. So if I have multiple grant sources for my project, my applicant share, would that, so I'll just, we'll use your numbers, right? $100,000 project.
Mhm.
I'm trying to get the whole project covered through, grants and donations, right? So say I asked for 20,000 for Motor Cities. My other grant applications are say 50,000, and I do, 10,000 and, or let's see,
Donation,
20,000 in fundraising.
Mhm.
Where would my applicant share? What would that number be?
Well, I mean, it would still be whatever the difference is between the project cost and what you asked us for. So it's everything
Okay.
else. So even if it comes from there, because we're not necessarily looking at the source of the income, we're looking at the source of the expense and making sure that it is, adding up to obviously the grand total. Because you'd be surprised, Scott. Sometimes you get an application, and that example, you got $100,000 project, and they say they're asking us for 20. And then the applicant shares 50, and we go, wait a minute, to carry the one, you take off your shoes and count. Something's still missing because you don't have the grand total that you need. So what we're trying to be sure of is that if we are considering investing our funds, that you have the remaining money set aside somewhere else or a source of it somewhere.
And in addition, Motor Cities would accept more of an applicant share. So for example, if by including in-kind work and other things that are eligible, if it exceeded that, that would be fine to put in too, and it actually has a benefit for Motor Cities in the long run when it comes to processing these applications.
Absolutely.
The other thing is if you had a bigger project, if you had grander ideas, that idea of phasing things, and then by letting Motor Cities know that you're phasing them leading to something very spectacular, that's a nice way to think about things. Chunk them out from year to year and let Motor Cities be aware of your intentions.
Yep, absolutely. No, you're right. You hit it right on the head there, Nancy, with the fact that the more applicant share there is, that's more additional match that shows more leveraging. So that even makes it even more appealing to the grant committee and the National Park Service when they see it, because they see that our investment is leveraging even more. So, great question and great insight there, Nancy. You've been around this block a few times, you know how this goes. All right, so some common questions as I mentioned. So what's the difference between total project costs and eligible costs? Again, some projects involve funds that are not eligible under our guidelines, which are the federal guidelines. So we would just make sure that those funds are separated. And some people ask, what are eligible costs? And Nancy's alluded to a few that we were going to bring up here today. So contractors and consultants and actual materials and services, staff hours, dedicated to the project with documentation. So it's important to note that if you're part of an organization and you say, I'm going to use my staff hours as match and be reimbursed for this, then you have to have a way to show us that it's not your general staff hours. So when I was in a meeting and when I was driving to Timbuktu, it's specific. Here is when I spent the time working on the Motor Cities project. Here's when I spent the time working on another project. Some organizations have sign-in sheets, have internal tracking mechanisms. We have a program for paychecks that tracks our time. So whichever method you use, if you were to say, I'm going to include staff hours in the budget, then just realize that you would have to then provide documentation to support those hours so that they've been identified separately for our purposes. Again, that's important because the Park Service wants to see that we're not funding hours that were spent on fundraising or other activities. So by being able to show that these are hours that were spent specifically, for our project, it makes it that much easier. We've never had an issue with that as long as people support it. Same thing with volunteer hours. Again, a lot of you use tons and tons of volunteer hours, which is completely acceptable, but you have to have some way that you are tracking those hours, whether it be the volunteers signing in and out, or you providing a full sort of record sheet of those hours and you signing them yourself, but something that says this person spent 20 hours working on it this week, and either they sign it or you got a log of all the hours and you sign it and you send it to us, and then those hours translate into dollars. So
and a volunteer electrician or a volunteer plumber
Yeah,
It's
even better.
it's a great way of getting some match depending on the work that you're carrying out.
Yeah, because the general volunteer amount is somewhere around $25 an hour. But if you've got a volunteer in a specialty area like Nancy mentioned, and you can get that person to send you a letter that says, you know, yeah, Don, I volunteered and I was your volunteer electrician, and my normal rate is $75 an hour, where ching, 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 ching. Now you've got a different level of match because they have contributed even at a higher value than you thought before. If you've got a lawyer reviewing your work and working on things too, that's great. Now, if you've got a lawyer painting your barn, then that doesn't translate the same. But if you've got someone who is, in fact, working in their specialty, they can give you more. Volunteer mileage, same thing. If you've got people having to drive to and fro for your event and for your activity, you need to have that with support materials, dates, start at the destination. So you have sort of a calculation of their mileage, and then we would go based on the 2022 mileage rate, which is yet to be published. But I think volunteer mileage was 18 cents an hour or 18 cents a mile or somewhere in that range.
Brian, this does not mean that the volunteer mileage is reimbursed to the volunteer, right? It's just they have contributed that.
They've contributed. So that's the idea, is that they've contributed that to the project as a volunteer, but you can use it as the match that we're describing here. So when people talk about how do we meet that match and get that grand total, it can come from actual cash and donations, but it can also come from a calculation of all of these elements as well, which a lot of times is very valuable, even more valuable sometimes to nonprofits than the other documents. And in-kind valuation with proper documentation. So this is anything else that's been donated to the project. Dick Russell out in Highland Recreation Area have really had great success with that when they're redoing something with the barn and someone's donated the glass or donated the wood or, donated their labor or whatever. That is something that adds huge value to the project. And if you can get that letter from that person, even the services that they may donate the haul away service, but something that shows that, hey, they donated this and it's of this value. It's on their letterhead. It's able to be transferred to us. It says they did it. That's huge value. So keep those in mind as you go through eligible costs. Ineligible, as I mentioned, are incidental costs not directly associated with the project, funds from another federal funding source, which of course we're part of the National Park Service. So if you're in this position where you receive block grants or you receive another source of funding that is traced back to federal dollars, then we can't be part of the same project that they are because they have their own matching requirements and we can't use our federal funds to match their federal funds. So that gets complicated, but hopefully it doesn't run into that. Yes, Russ.
Right. Let me give you, see if I understand it. Let's say you had a project that you budgeted out for $100,000. Mm-hmm. And that's the money that it would take to do the job. But then in addition, you had volunteer hours and volunteer mileage and everything. So really then when you submitted it, the total project cost might be $110,000 or $120,000.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep. And so that, like Scott's question about how you change that calculation. So yeah, you would just add all those volunteer and donated hours as well, and just say, well, hey, the total project is 125, and we were asking for 20 from Motor City. So the other is just additional match and additional dollars that you generated to make it work. So yep.
So you're guessing, but you're really guessing ahead of time that you're going to get those volunteer hours and mileage, yeah. Right?
Some people use it like that, and some people are very confident in their volunteer schedule and their workflow, and so they can easily pin that down. But some people are, you're right, they can be a little more hesitant, and that's okay. That some people don't use it for that reason because they don't want to promise one thing.
If you overestimate it, then it doesn't matter, because if you estimate $1,000 volunteer hours and mileage, and you only have 500, that's all you.
That's all you can reimburse for.
Yeah,
so
that's all.
But that's another reason why it might be good to try to overestimate your contribution in case something falls through as you're developing the project. And that way you're maximizing the amount of actual cash reimbursement that you're getting from Motor Cities.
Yep, exactly. So as I mentioned, funds from other federal sources, activities that are perceived as fundraising. So sometimes at the beginning of a project, you're having to have dinners and meetings and plan on things and woo clients and woo funders. And, so we cannot receive an application that says I had to fly to Washington State to talk to someone about giving me money, because that is not allowable under the federal guidelines. Plus, it didn't actually generate the product that you're describing for the project. So we have to avoid those. Food and beverage costs can get out of hand. You know, a lot of times there's some innocent, hey, we had to, you know, we did a pizza lunch for the volunteers. That's one thing. But sometimes, again, we were working late. We all had to order out. We had $75 steaks, and, you know, and it all adds up. And all of a sudden you spend more money on that process than you have on the actual project. So we exclude food and beverage costs unless they are absolutely necessary to the project. General promotion of events, conferences, etc. So this is where all of our event partners who come to us and apply, we can't just be essentially a sponsor. And that's a tricky spot. We can't be a sponsor because the Park Service doesn't allow it. We can't just take the funds and put it behind a value for putting our name on something. It has to be for a project or a product. So general promotion doesn't work. You know, a lot of times a conference will come and say, you know, put your name on this conference and this many people will see it. What we're more into is funding a session of a conference, funding a speaker's honorarium, you know, supporting a very particular element of something. What we're into with events is, do you have a children's education area? Do you have a partnership with a local museum? If you're running in Flint, they run back to the bricks, but they have a section where the Sloan Museum may be doing their hands-on education area. That's the portion where we would say, apply to us for that. And that's a little closer to what we'll be able to fund, or even Scott in Lansing, when we're doing Car Capital show, when you're doing tours in the Model Ts and doing the educational romps around Lansing, that's closer to what we want to fund than saying just being a sponsor of the event, because it's
and possibly a brochure that outlines the history of the location. That's one way you can sort of get around, you know, you're sort of promoting your museum, but at the same time, you know, if you're combining that brochure with information and a walking tour or something in one, that would be acceptable, I believe.
No, absolutely. No, that's a great example. Sorry, and the final thing on here is utilities and maintenance costs, which cannot be easily identified. You know, for the reason I described earlier about volunteer hours and staff hours, if you've got your general DTE bill, your general AT&T bill, consumers energy, that sort of thing, that you can't say, well, this amount of the energy went towards the work we had to do here, and you just have a basic phone bill, a basic water bill, then there's no way to break those things out. Then you shouldn't include those costs into a grant to us. If you were able to separate it and say, we had to pay to get the water main installed because we're installing a sprinkler system, then you got a very direct cost for a specific project. Or Lena, if you're talking about the issues with furnace, though you may have a wildly outrageous gas bill because of those issues, really what we'd be looking at is what are the costs of actually replacing the materials for the furnace to get it up and running, not the utilities associated with it. So those are examples there. All right, so let's get into the project summary, which will be the third section of your projects. Now we've gone through organizational information, budget information. Now we get into the actual meat and potatoes. What is your project all about? And that's where you would have the opportunity to explain these things to us. So the application will be evaluated in these 5 areas. So we tell you up front what they are. You're able to write your proposal to those specifications. So we'll be talking about its relevance to our mission, its capacity to achieve based on the budget. So, you know, do you have the funds in hand? Do you have the ability to execute? Have you done the projects like this before? You know, these are all things that we'd be looking at to make sure that you're in the viable area. Do you have a sustainability plan or a business plan? So how are you planning to move forward? We're not looking to necessarily support one-offs. I mean, as you see from this call, we've had long-term relationships with organizations over the years, and that's what we want to have is ways that we are seeding and supporting projects long-term, not necessarily a one and done sort of relationship. So we want to keep that long-term project. How is Motor Cities recognized? Of course, we're using federal funds and our own funding. And like most funders, we want to make sure that there's something there, a line, a placard, whatever it is that you're able to do, and you'll describe it to us, whatever it is that you're able to do to identify Motor Cities support of your project. A lot of times it's a small plaque or something that you do close to the site, if it's a physical thing, or if you're able to include our name in a brochure or in the back of something, or some way that we would be identified. And then the performance measures for the project. You know, how are you validating that you did what you said you were going to do at the end of it? And we'll step through a few examples of that. Again, this is the actual form. So this is what it'll look like when you're in the grant application. You'll enter a summary paragraph. This is sort of the synopsis of your project, only 400 words. So we want to keep it concise. You're not writing the book here. You're writing the book here. So this is where you would include your project description, the full scope and timeline and budget, all the details of your project sort of fall into this category. And this is a wide open field in the form, so you would be able to put as much information as you can. I encourage people, when you're writing a grant like this, to draft it somewhere else, so that you're not writing into the form and thinking about it as you go, and the light flips out or your computer goes haywire and you say, I lost 2 pages worth of content. Probably draft it somewhere else and then port it over into this space. But you'll be able to see all of this, and understand how to fill it all out. And then this is where you would start to upload these elements that we've described. So please attach the relevant organizational plan. So it's your business plan, your strategic plan, master plan, interpretive plan, whatever it is that's guiding you. So it says, this is why we're going for this grant at this point in time. So it may be that you are in year 6 of a 10-year interpretive plan, and this is the point where you need to install this exhibit. Perfect. So you've got a plan that allows us to see where we fit into it and what's going to happen after that. Or maybe your business plan that says, this is how we're going to get our nonprofit up and running, or this is how we're going to activate, activity and membership. So include that. So whatever is relevant in this category. And if there's question about it, just, let me know, and we can talk about what we're looking for, what you may have that may fit this. And sustainability plan is you describing how the project is going to be sustained afterwards. This is definitely valuable for brick and mortar sort of projects. I'm installing an exhibit, or, we're acquiring something at the museum. We want to see how that's going to be viable beyond just the period of time that we're funding it, if that's the intention. If you're starting a program and you expect it to go on beyond the period of time that we're funding it, then how are you going to do that? Let us know what your plan is, and we're going to solicit more funders. We already have an endowment fund that supports this, that kind of thing. Or even what you're thinking about doing. Maybe you launch the program and you say, we think that once it's launched, we'll be able to solicit funds from this local support or this other grantor that's going to help us out. So some sustainability plans, so we know where it's going. And then, again, this is where you would be able to answer that question of how Motor Cities will be recognized. So it could be signage, it could be a media event, celebration event. We don't have a problem coming out to grand openings and ribbon cuttings and, that sort of thing. So that's always exciting. So whatever it is that you feel is most appropriate for your event, because it can vary from organization to organization and event to event. Sometimes you can't put a sign or a placard on a section of roof that's been repaired. So it's not as easy for some areas as it is for others. But whatever it is that you think you can do, let's talk about it here. And then we talk about performance measures. So each project will need to identify and implement its measures. So how will you report on how your project was successful? So if you're preserving an artifact or a site, if you say that's what you're going to do, then there should be some evidence of, okay, at the end of this, we were able to save the old mill. Or you're attracting visitors and you say, okay, this new exhibit is going to attract visitors. Give us the starting number, give us the ending number. Say, before we install this new exhibit, we had 5,000 visitors during this period, and now we've got 10,000. And, so at least we have a measurable. If you say your project is going to educate children and you have a direct access to that, then you obviously would need to tell us, well, how many students was this put in the hands of, or how many people had the opportunity to interact with this once you created it? And distribution models. So if you've created a brochure or a booklet or something educational, how was it distributed? Did you just create a bunch of crates of it and now it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere? We would want to hear how you got it out to the public. We distributed it at events. We send it out through the school system. We posted it in the libraries, that kind of thing. So what's your strategy for distribution that you'll be able to come back and, let us in on later on? And you would explain those in this field, in this section that's provided in the grant application. So once again, there's, not much of a surprise factor there. You'd be able to put that right in there, and tell us how you're measuring it, what methodology you use to collect your data. If you say you improve visitorship, was it based on surveys or just somebody clicking a clicker, or, website views? What is it that you use to calculate that? That should be pretty straightforward.
And I think Motor Cities is really a sharing organization too.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a pilot, or I think Motor Cities would really like that idea of being able to share your experiences or different things that can help other people, whether it's, providing some template or whatever works. But, that's how Motor Cities really has been successful, I think, is by coordinating and by working with partners and by sharing experiences of one partner with another, all of that. So that, I think, is part of our interests.
Sure, for sure. Yep. And that's also why we make this note about, because it is funded by the federal funds, that the support documents may be required for future program review. So it may be necessary to say, this is how we collected this data via visitor surveys, and just to validate that you did indeed do that, so that we have something to report back to. But normally it's just really to, as Nancy said, to share that data and funnel it, send it up to our authorizers and say, well, this is how our partners were able to leverage the funds. And they're always thumbs up about that. Here are some examples. So if a performance tool for education, so if their performance measure was after installation of a new Buick exhibit, museum attendance will increase by 2,000 people over the next quarter. So the way you would measure that, of course, is you would look at ticket admissions sold from one period of time to the next period of time. So over that quarter, and then the outcome should be that the total students who visit the exhibit on field trips from this period to that period increased by the number that you described. So you would have to measure it during that period of time, and then give us the outcomes during that period of time, something that can be achieved within that window of time that you described. And this is an example of that. So if you were doing a project that dealt with education interpretation, that was your measure, then that's how you would explain how you reach that measure. Let's say you were dealing with, oh, yes, Russ.
I have a question. So let's say if you did a project and it finally got completed, about a month before the end of the grant, and then the impact would be in the months following. Do you document them? Can you only document what's been accomplished during that period of the grant?
We would, of course, ideally we want to get sort of as final a number as we can for reporting up. So yeah, your example of, hey, if you just finished a project a month before the grant period and now you're trying to report out on it, we want the best that we can, because we do have to close them out and we do have to give some reporting, but we have also allowed for subsequent reporting. There are some projects we've gone back to and said, well, you installed this last year, can you give us some feedback on how those numbers went? They aren't officially part of like the final report that we send, but what we do is tally it on and send it to the next year's report. So we'd say this project that we completed last year generated this many more visitors in the 2021 year, something like that.
But you could make estimates, I guess, as a part of this and say it's estimated.
To an extent. But I think we want to keep it actual, so if there's actual viewership and actual numbers, if you finish the film on Northfield and then it's publicized and you say we had 100 people at the grand opening, then at the premiere, then there are 100 people that saw it. And the year following that, if we come back to you and say, well, after it premiered and it toured around for a while, how many more people saw it? He said, oh yeah, about 1,500 more people came to see it. Then we add that number onto next year's total. But we could have to get some number.
Yeah, I was going to say, and Russ, I think what that does is, if you do follow up yourself without Motor Cities having to follow up on your project, it might just make you look better, for the next grant that comes up. The fact that you could demonstrate beyond, how successful your film was, or whatever, after the grant period.
Right. So there's that example. Revitalization is a difficult one, but let's say that the project says that we will produce an operable architectural and engineering plan for this historical property. Then the obvious output for that would be to present the plan. I mean, you would give us the thing that you said you were going to create. Your revitalization sometimes is very cut and dry. If you say we're going to put a section of the roof on, then by the end of the project, there's the section of the roof installed. So it's pretty straightforward. But this example of installing, creating a plan, you will present the plan as part of your measurement of your tool. Long term, we really couldn't track that, because after that, it's up to you to how you use the plan. But in this example, the plan is the output. The plan is the product that you're producing. And under here,
you have numbers of how many people went to the bathroom. Is that in some of them?
Well, no, but if the goal is that the restroom will create, opportunity for more handicap accessibility and visitorship, then obviously the tracking would be just to say, well, how many people came that were, otherwise maybe wouldn't have been able to access the facility. And so that may be a good track. And it may not be a huge number, but it's a significant enough number for the purpose of building the bathroom. So in Scott's example of building the bathrooms, or Rogers, you'd have some way to say we were able to increase things by this amount. It wouldn't be the number that used the bathroom. I hate to count flushes, but it would be the number of people maybe who were able to attend an event who otherwise wouldn't have. Roger, I don't know how many weddings you could have without a bathroom for the bride to go through. Number be pretty small, right?
Brian, before bathrooms, 8 a year. Now we average 80.
There you go. So those numbers pop as somehow they were managing. I'm surprised you got the 8 a year with they were in porta potties.
It was a fight with the bride's mothers.
Yeah, yeah. And that's never a position you want to be in. So there you go. But good example. Last one on heritage tourism. So if the person said that their new Henry Ford and family tour would deliver 1,000 participants. So the output was that, okay, you look at ticket sales between the period of time that the tour was available. But an outcome long-term might be that you get exit surveys from those tour participants to understand their appreciation for Henry Ford, sort of pre and post. So you could exemplify that not only was it the person attended the tour, but the long-term outcome is that this person had a more positive perception or understanding or appreciation of Henry Ford. Obviously, that would be the goal of doing a tour like that. So you measure that, and that's a nice little bonus because you give them an outcome that's a little more long-term than just a single output. You can say a bunch of people took the tour, but how many people actually gained from it in appreciation, which is what the intention was. So
And a
these are
lot
nice
of these
examples.
things wouldn't be a one-off, because if you start systematically doing some work towards measuring for grant purposes, it might be an annual thing that you do for your own benefit of your own organization, as an
Right.
example.
Well, I mean, we want to get people in that habit of collectors of information and evaluation, so that you're always seeking to improve yourself. So that's important. And I think this helps that, even in a small way. With a small grant through us, it kind of gets you in that mindset of making sure you're evaluating your programming and your activities. So a few more things to cover. We're going to try to wrap by the half of the hour here. So let's talk about the budget. The budget section of this is where you upload that particular file. It can be, most people use an Excel spreadsheet. It's easy to utilize and manipulate. It's preferable for me as well, because once I receive it, I can download it and use it in that form. This is also the first reference to the reports that are due after the project is done. So everything that you've submitted up to this point, you'll be reporting on it after it's done. So those performance measures that you create, that says I'm going to track visitors, or I'm going to install a portion of the roof, or our bathrooms are going to draw more events. Then at the end of this project, you're going to report on that and say, well, how many more people came because of the bathrooms, or what did you complete the section of the roof? Please upload the picture. So just realize that whatever you put in that first section, you'll be reporting on in these reports. And these reports are due either within 45 days of the completion of the project, or November 15th, whichever comes first. So obviously, if our project's in September 30th, November 15th is 45 days after that. But some people finish their projects way early, and whenever you're ready to report, we're ready to receive that. So that's not an issue. More on that to come, but that's the first point. You'll see that reference there. You'll be able to click onto a live link and see that form too if you're curious about it. But it's pretty straightforward. So this is where you upload the budget details, so it outlines what the expenses are. Budget should show all the elements of the projects that lead to a completion. So you asked this question earlier, Russ, examples of if your costs also include volunteer hours and donated goods and the value of all of that, they'd include all of that in your budget. You don't have to limit it to just the cash outlay. You put the entire budget together and say, this is what it takes to put on the Auto Heritage Awards. It's not just the cost of the tent or the cost of the awards. It's the volunteer hours, it's the graphic design, it's the, all of that sort of stuff that you can calculate to make it work. So any of these elements and more could be included in your budget. Contractors, consultants, materials, staff hours, volunteers, and in kind. There's also a section for other support materials. I mentioned earlier that you would have to upload a copy of your IRS determination letter. This is where that goes. We've asked for a copy of your board of directors or whatever your appropriate governing body is, whether it's a commission or a county or a city or whomever governs you, someone that is responsible for your organization. Letters of support, we would expect at least one. So there's one that's required if you see this little asterisk. So at least one. I mean, we figure any project that's sort of worth its salt and being considered would have at least one person that would speak up for them. And then the more, the better. So if you add more here in optional materials, you could add more letters of support. Some people have uploaded, here's our more copies of our plan, or renderings of our project, other documents, but anything that you think would help the grant committee in reviewing your project and making your case more clear should go in that section for supporting materials, and just upload it there. And now that you've been awarded a grant, so we've done the application, we assume that everybody here is smiling on October 1st because their grant has been approved and awarded, and we're ready to move forward. The recipients are now have access to a reimbursement form. It's also on the website, so it's not a secret, but it's on the website under motorcities.org/grants, and there's the form right there for downloading. But that is how you receive the money. So that now that you've applied for your grant and you're going to spend $100,000, and when you apply, you go through October, and hey, November 1st, we got our first invoice, and for 10 grand, I want to upload it and get it paid. You upload that invoice with a proper attachment, and you send it to us for evaluation, and then we process it, and hopefully if there's no issue, we send back the appropriate reimbursement. So that's sort of how smooth the process can be, assuming that there's no issues, hangups, any missing documentation, that sort of thing. But in your supporting documents, remember that you'll need to provide, if you've got a contractor, you need to see their invoice, you need to see the canceled check to that person to match up, or however you paid them, credit card statement, or some receipt that says that you actually paid them. So evidence of payment, donation letters, any supporting documents that you need to attach would be included as you send your reimbursement request. Examples of supporting documents. So direct expenses, say invoice from a vendor in its original form, accompanied by the canceled check or evidence of payment. So this is not your accounting of it. This is not an email from the person. This is, a copy of their invoice that they sent to you that triggered the payment. And record of pay for employees, including method of tracking time. So if you use internal costs, then you need to be able to share with us some sort of spreadsheet, some sort of report, something that backs that up. Sometimes people get very far down that road, then they say, oh no, we're a university and we can't share out, for instance, internal, and that's understandable, but we just want to make sure that up front that in order to claim those hours, you have to have some way to share that with us. If it's too private, too internal, too complicated to get to, then you probably don't want to include those sorts of hours in there if you can't do that. And in kind, many varieties of it, but I'll just give you a few examples here. Donor generated communication, which is dated and indicates that they made X contribution for Y project. So in this case, it can be an email that says, hey, Don, I was happy to come out and bring 1,000, pallets of bags to your event, and they were worth $5,000. And, that is as much of a constitution of their donation as if they had sent you a letter formally, So however you receive it from them, just make sure that it is dated and clearly identifies what they contributed for your project. Not you gave it to Don, but you gave it to Don for his specific event. That's important. And volunteer timesheets in some form of tracking. As I mentioned, you can have a single timesheet that everybody signs in on. You can have an individual one that says Steve Purdy showed up on this day for this many hours, on this day for this many hours, just something that supports that. And then final grant closeout. So this is everything's done, grant's finished, everybody's happy. So along with your final financial report, which everybody is always up on that to make sure they get their final drawdown of funds, you also have to submit the final performance report. So after everything's said and done, you need to submit the report that says, this is what we did and how we did it. And again, in the spirit of transparency, this is exactly what it looks like. Has your project been completed? Yes or no? Include the measurable outputs that you described and were they achieved, explaining why or why not. Provide a copy of the tools that you use to measure. So if you said we measured attendance, that was via tickets, or that was via clicker, or that was via eyeball test, whatever it is. And then we asked a question about whether or not you'd be likely to participate in another project in the future based on your experience. Hopefully it's very smooth and very enjoyable. So you would say very likely. You would upload the recognition portion. So it's a picture of a plaque. It's a recognition in the publication. It's us at our event or whatever, but you want to upload that. And then any additional comments you want to add to it would go here. Lot covered. I said we were going to get it in underneath the half hour, and we are right at that. And I'm glad that you asked the questions as we went along. So that way, if there were any questions, we didn't, kind of stockpile them up until the end. But that's pretty straightforward. I will say that the differences in the mini grant project is that there would not be the reimbursement process that I described. The mini grant projects are funded half up front and half at the end. So if you receive a mini grant and it's $1,500, as soon as you receive the grant and sign the grant agreement, you get half of that. And then you get the other half when you complete the grant. You still do the closeout report and submit your requests for the funding, but you get the amount split in 2 different payments. So that's the key difference there between the challenge grant process and the mini grants. That's why I went so deep on the challenge grant, because the mini grant one is just that simple as far as the way it's awarded and funded. But if there are any other questions, please feel free, unmute. Yes, Roger.
Brian, I noticed, I thought was a change. It's a small item, but initially one of the questions you ask, then it's because the National Park Service wants to know if you are a landmark,
Mhm.
but they didn't ask about historic places. There's far more historic places on the National Park Service than there are landmark. And I used to check that box that we were we're a historic landmark, but I won't check that box now because I'm not a landmark. I'm a historic place.
Right. Yeah, it is a difference, and they are. You're right, Roger, in the numbers, sheer numbers. That there are way more National Historic Places on the registry than there are historic landmarks. Just a handful, really.
Okay.
But they kind of tout more efforts and work around National Historic Landmarks and places, because landmarks also have some. It's blurry, or it's kind of foggy, but they have a little more as far as Section 106 oversight in historic renovations and things.
Okay.
However, and that should be the case with historic places too, but a lot of times there simply is a sort of whatever your local jurisdiction says. And a lot of times we defer to the Michigan SHPO, for instance, for oversight on that. But on the federal level, if they see something's being done with a National Historic Landmark, it perks up a little bit more. Their eyes are a little bit more open to see what's really going on, especially if they see some sort of renovation or physical activity going on.
But Roger, that doesn't prevent you from saying that.
No.
Well, it's a checkbox. Where would I do that? I went by kind of fast. I'll look at it when I review it on June 1st. But yeah, we're in the process of applying for landmark status, upgrading from historic place. But it's we figure you got another 4 years to go in that process.
It's a process for sure. We happily,
yeah,
but we're proud to say we've been part of a good handful of historic landmark designations over the 20 years. And that's saying something, because it does take a lot. But when we started, Paquette was not a National Historic Landmark, and the Meadowbrook Hall, the Edsel Ford House, the GM Tech Center in Warren, these were all sites that became historic landmarks in the time since we've been working with them. So
those might be the only ones in the heritage area.
Well, I mean, there are other ones existed prior to that. For instance, the original Packard plant downtown was a historic landmark.
Was it landmark or only historic place?
No, it was a landmark. As I look at the list, the Lincoln Motor Plant was a historic landmark. So these are places that they've been decommissioned since then, but they were established. So they all existed. Highland Park, for instance, the Rouge Plant. These are ones that already existed. The Henry Ford Estate, Meadowbrook I already mentioned, but these were already historic landmarks before we started. They were designated in the 60s and the 70s, but since we started, those are the ones that we've been involved in.
All of that doesn't hurt to say, Roger, because it just suggests that you have aspirations beyond historic place.
Fine. I'll do that.
And Roger, to maybe it's your suggestion, because it's not in there now, that maybe we should add a second, button that says, "Are you a historic place?" Not just the landmark, but the place. It only asks for landmark now. So your eyes did not deceive you. You were correct in that.
Okay.
Roger, just remember that if it's taking you 4 years to get it done, how much longer it would take if you didn't have bathrooms.
You'd be running out all the time. You would never.
I had to say it.
You would only be able to stay there a few hours at a time, and then you'd have to leave. So just a reminder then, as we're still fielding questions, the grant cycle will open June 1st. It will end Friday, August 13th. We should have award announcements by October 1st. Again, this is contingent on this issue that we're battling. For those who are board members know that we're dealing with the national parks and the funding situation, but we're all very optimistic. We've not failed it yet. We've been granting for almost 20 years. So I don't think there's a reason that we're not going to be in business for this year. So I remain optimistic, because what other choice do you have? And then we're looking for projects again that will be completed by September 30th of 2022, at least the phase, as Nancy mentioned. There's nothing wrong with phasing projects, because we can always say we were completing phase 1, which is the rollout of this program. Phase 2 could be the future of it, and you could apply for a separate grant. And that's great too. We've done that many times over the years. So there's nothing wrong with phasing, but for the sake of compartmentalizing into a single calendar year, we want to talk about what could be completed between this date and that date. Any other questions? Covered a lot. I'm
On
available.
on the mini grants, is all of that, you know, budgeting and documentation and everything required for the mini grant?
There are a few items that aren't necessary, and they're detailed in the mini grant application. So you would not have to supply the sustainability plan and the organizational management plan and that sort of thing. But yes, you would have to still provide, like IRS determination. We could still only grant to nonprofits, that sort of thing. That's all still very specific. We can't grant to individuals or for-profit organizations, regardless of the size of it. So that's still the same, but you wouldn't have to go as deep with the plan. You would still have to provide a budget with the detail, yes.
Is there a separate form for
Thanks, I gotta run.
separate form for that?
Yeah, it'll be a separate application. Thanks, Scott. We got all the questions. Thanks, Scott, for joining us. Appreciate that. Any other questions? We have used the time well, and I think we've covered a lot of ground. I don't want to have anybody with their eyes glazed over going, whoo, that was a lot. So feel free. Our contact information is here. My contact information was also shown on the screen, so you know how to get in touch with me. Ask questions, because that's what I'm here for, is to be there for the period of time when the grant application is open, to say, I was thinking about this. What do you think about this? Can I include these elements? How do you think this partnership works? So that by the time you submit it, that the grant committee is getting the most complete and thorough application, and there's no issues that we've left, you know, unanswered, so that you don't want them to have to ask. You want me to ask the question so that when they get it, it's, you know, it's smooth sailing. So anything else? Yes, Don.
I just wanted to bring up too, with all the organizations that are here today, if you are a Motor Cities member, we'd love to have you put our Motor Cities logo on your website, you know, and promote Motor Cities to your organization and to your visitors and group as well. You'll see it on all of our advertising with our events and stuff, even though we do not take funding to put those events on for Motor Cities, but we are a member of Motor Cities. So we want to, you know, keep that working relationship going.
Give them an amen, Bob.
I second that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it only helps the circulation of information about us and exhibits the partnerships, right? You know, the relationships that we've all had and that we all flourish from. So I think that is great advice, and we always push for people to promote the heritage area. You should be proud that we're all part of this collective. So yeah. Any other questions? We're over time, and I don't mind staying, but any other questions that we have? If not, I'm fully available, ready to answer, you know, whatever you have on your mind, and we will look forward to your applications, and we will talk to you soon then.